ahead and great. So welcome everyone. My name is Catherine. I'm co-owner of Canio's Books. We welcome you to our lunchtime with an international fiction focus. We have Indira Ganesan and Murzban Shroff with us today. We're going to have an interesting discussion between the two of them, and also they're going to talk about their process and read from their works. But before Marianne introduces them, I just want to let you know about a few upcoming events that we have actually at the end of the week here at Canio's. We're starting to do outdoor book signings, which is a sign of a return to a bit of normalcy. And so this Saturday from 2:30 to 4, the environmental writer Erica Serino will be here, and she'll be signing her book, Thicker Than Water, The Quest for Solutions to the Plastic Crisis. Now, join us Friday night, because at 7 o'clock on Zoom, Erica is going to give a talk about her book. And as a scientist and artist, she traveled the globe to track plastics from their creation to their disposal and the impact that it has on our environment. And she has come up with some potential solutions for how we can mitigate this global disaster. So that's going to be this Friday at 7. I'll drop in the chat the link to the Zoom in a moment, and we hope that you can all return and join us for that. So we're thrilled again to have everyone with us, and I'm going to turn it over now to Marianne to introduce our distinguished writers. Thank you.
So good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are delighted to welcome dear friend Indira Ganesan and new friend Murzban Shroff to Canio's Zoom event. I will introduce Indira first, and each writer will be giving you a sample of their work and kind of setting their work in a context for you. After the presentations, we'll have conversation, and we welcome your questions if you'd like to put a question in the chat. So I'll introduce Indira now, and at the conclusion of your presentation, Indira will switch to Murzban, and I'll give Murzban's introduction thereafter. I want to, first of all, let you all know we have books available. These are 3 of Indira's titles and Murzban's book available here for you at the bookshop. Okay, a little bit of background about Indira Ganesan. She is the author of 3 novels, The Journey, Inheritance, and As Sweet as Honey. She was born in Srirangam, India. I may not be pronouncing that right, I'm sorry. She grew up in St. Louis and Rockland County, graduated from Vassar College and the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Indira first came to Provincetown, where she lives presently, in 1984 as a fellow of the Fine Arts Work Center. She hosted at that time the Monday First Light on WOMR radio. More about that soon. Indira has held fellowships from the Paden Institute at Radcliffe, the McDowell Colony, the Paden Institute for Writers of Color. She's taught fiction and essay writing for 30 years at various campuses, including UC San Diego and Santa Cruz, at Southampton College, LIU, here in our neck of the woods, also at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetry in Naropa. 2011, Indira returned to live full-time in Cape Cod. She's working there on a new novel. She teaches at Emerson College and at the Wellfleet Preservation Hall. She writes book reviews, wonderful book reviews for Phi Beta Kappa's thekeyreporter.org. So Indira also currently is a radio DJ of a wonderful program called Namaste, a program of global music featuring music from the subcontinent and beyond. You can check this out early Sunday mornings or anytime via computer at WOMR. And we are delighted to have Indira with us this morning. So please give a warm welcome via Zoom to Indira Ganesan.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this beautiful day here on Cape Cod. It's gorgeous outside. We're having very temperate temperatures, I suppose you could say. It's so good to see all of you. So let's see. I thought I would read a little bit from my last book, which has one of the most gorgeous covers. I'm so pleased to see it. And that I've had, I mean. And this is a book that was, I guess in terms of like giving it a little context, it's just the story of a family. It's about love, a little bit about loss, and it has as a kind of background of referencing to the lighthouse in Virginia Woolf. But really it's just a novel, and I'll read a little bit. Okay. 1. Our Aunt Metterling stood over 6 feet tall, a giantess, a tree. From her limbs came large hands which always held a shower of snacks for us children. We could place 2 of our feet in one of her sandals, and her green shawl made for a roof to cover our play forts. We loved Metterling because she was so devotedly freakish, because she reigned everyone with affection, and because we felt that anyone that tall had to be supernaturally gifted. No one actually said she was a ghost, or a saint, or a witch, but we watched for signs nevertheless. We knew, that is to say, she knew we suspected her of tricks, for she often smiled at us and displayed sleight of hand, pulling coins and shelves out of thin air. But that, said Rossi, didn't prove anything. Rossi had read the Puffin Book of Magic Tricks and pretty much knew them all and was not so easily impressed. What was interesting and never expected was that our Aunt Metterling married the littlest man she knew. He was 4'7", dapper and jolly. The grown-ups were embarrassed and affronted, for like Auntie Sita said, it was bad enough having a freakishly tall woman in the family. Yet, in some way, they were all relieved that Aunt Metterling found Uncle Archer, and he her. The wedding was a small enough affair as weddings go, but the bridegroom did ride into town in a white baby Aston Martin decked with garlands of roses and basil. The first marriage rites took place at dawn. And it's just a little taste of that novel. And for the past several years, I've been working on something a little different. It's more of a historical novel based on a woman who existed in history and about whom I couldn't find a whole lot of biography on. She's mentioned in a few accounts, accounts of the Mughal era, and in some accounts of her father, she's not mentioned at all, which is kind of surprising. A wonderful scholar named Annie Krieger Krenicki in France wrote a biography of her, a kind of speculative biography called The Captive Princess. And that was published by Gallimard. And also, sorry, it was published by Oxford University Press of Pakistan. But it's since gone into, retirement. And actually you can buy like a copy for $1,000 plus on Amazon, which is kind of astonishing. But you can also find it in libraries, which is what I did. So that was a point of reference for me. But I'd like you to read, I'd like to read a little bit of this new work. So here goes, thank you. It's called, well, the title is still in contention. It's a prologue. Our family has a history of nude sunbathing. We have an ancestor who famously had her portrait painted bearing her plump breasts on a palace terrace, holding 2 tame birds in her hands. Her feet are massaged by a servant while another waits to fetch water if needed or a book. We are also a family of readers, and this ancestor liked to read the poets of her day, especially the women poets. She harbored a wish to write herself one day. The women poets wrote of love, of nature, and of God. Desire was written in metaphor, and an aspiration to be holy became code for the need to be touched in some places. This is a story of women who are haunted, restless, and itchy, women who tried to quench their ambition in order to be good, but failed. This is a story of women who liked to read and liked their breasts and valued their freedom while they had it. That freedom was, of course, taken away and to this day not fully recovered. Life is different now, but different in ways that cannot be equally measured, for equality was never a possibility. This is also a ghost story. The wall between the ancestors and the present is a thin one, and sometimes one will pass through at will, visiting descendants and others. Ghost is one word for such appearances, or spirit, figment of imagination and hallucination, or other terms. No matter, for it was a fact that as the gods once visited mortals frequently, even lived and died among them, so did these travelers, these messengers of a world beyond our own. 1. The moon laps the days in regular rhythm that knocks each day into night, or each night into day. Through her window, it passes in silver light, tracing shadowed shape over the stones, the floor riddled with tiny holes, home to creatures she sees only rarely. If she is lucky, she passes the night in sleep. Most nights, though, she tries to scratch some lines to match the luminous night, poems that are steeped in a nostalgia of what had been, what was once in her grasp. The first 90 nights she passed in her cell, she let herself the luxury of tears, salt water staining her pages, her clothes. The days were difficult to pace. The hours moved so slowly. Twice a day, a hummingbird buzzed at her window after sipping from flowers she could not see. She tried to imagine the slender beak dipping into the fuchsia and salvia, the impossible hovering on tireless wings, the darting that visited each bloom. Below the tower, somewhere, there are roses because the wind carries a faint scent on days that then become imbued with a fantastical illumination. She draws in each delicious breath, feeling faint-headed with gratitude. In the end, nature will stand by her. She recognizes with a start when no one else will. She has lost her father. For months, she thought that he would visit her, or at the very least, answer the letters she used to send daily. But he has cut her off just as coldly as he has ordered her imprisonment. She at first thought it was a joke, an elaborate ruse to scare her. Hadn't her father tried a trick when she was a child, refusing to leave Daulatabad for Agra because she did not want to leave behind a pregnant mare? She had cried and stamped her feet, and at last her father gave the signals for the elephants to start moving. She watched the pack start to leave, all her family atop watching her and laughing, the vast caravan moving along slowly. Only when she could no longer recognize anyone did she become afraid and start to run after them. At that point, a courier in horseback picked her up and delivered her to her father. Now, decades later, was her father just testing her again, waiting to release her so she could fall at his feet and swear to behave herself from now on? The hours struggled by. It felt like the time itself was in as much turmoil as she was, though the sun and moon kept regular pace. Meals were not irregular. Fruit and milk coffee arrived in the morning and cooked food later. Thank goodness her father allowed her variety. When he imprisoned her grandfather, he facetiously ordered the old man to be fed his choice of food, but only that one food. If Shah Jahan had chosen eggplant, then it was only eggplant he could eat. The former emperor's cook advised his liege to choose lentils, for he promised he could prepare dal with such variety that he would not repeat the same dish in a year. Her father ordered no such restriction on her, yet sometimes she felt even that was dismissive. When she was first imprisoned, the princess kept busy. She spent long hours staring into space, taking note as well of the construction of the walls. Her room was small, with an alcove for her toilet and bath. Frayed rugs covered the floor, the ones retired after their use in royal apartments. The window had a latch shutter, but the star and honeycomb pattern was large enough for her to see through if she stood slant. She could see a triangle of garden, river, and sky, a few birds rushing by. One rare day, a bright kingfisher. Her mind, she realized, needed to concentrate on movement so that an element of surprise could keep it from atrophying. Happy were the days it rained, for then she saw the droplets in symphony descending in strength. She tried to remember math problems she had solved to puzzle herself. She invented an alternate system of numbers, creating her own rules. And from that, it was easy to invent another language. To test herself, she'd ask herself to name 5 things that started with the first letter, say, of the new alphabet, timing herself. Sometimes the guards heard laughter coming from her room and thought their princess was slowly going mad. And who could blame her, all alone? Instead, Zebenusa was laughing with glee for having bested herself. She cleared the state and began another game. She was born during a mild February in 1638, sliding between the narrow thighs of her 17-year-old mother, wrapped in soft silk, wiped clean of blood and labor. The holy call to prayer was whispered in her right and left ears. Firstborn of 11 children, a princess, her grandfather none other than Shah Jahan, Emperor of India. Her father, delighted despite himself for getting a daughter, named her Zebenusa on her 7th day. She would be the ornament of womankind, for he, her father Aurangzeb, was the ornament of the world. At age 7, she memorized the book of books, and from then on could not devour books quickly enough. To celebrate, her father, also a Hafiz, threw a party and showered everyone with gold. Later in life, though, the princess called herself the Hidden One. What she hid first were her poems, under pillows, under lamps, in trunks filled with fine muslins her father could not see. Much later, she hid her opinions and longings and ambition, only she didn't do it so well. Her father had been proud of her poetry at one time. The scholar encouraged him to let him learn many languages, study a multitude of books, learn to write in Persian. She studied language, astronomy, math, and science. He agreed to let her have tutors, but worried she might grow too wild in her thoughts. One day he overheard her reciting some verses in the garden as she walked, but quickly she saw him and so changed the words love to prayer, passion to devotion, wine to water. Her father was ambitious and proud and bitter because his father did not favor him. Shah Jahan's eldest son, Dara, was the apple, the lotus, the pomegranate of the royal eye. Dara was an artist and aesthete, a poet, while Aurangzeb was a soldier and self-righteous, indigent and lacking charm. Zebenusa would never have had to hide her words if Dara had been her father, but she adored her grumpy father, or at least she did once before he became someone she could not recognize. Suffering in her father's neglect, he grew ruthless. One by one, he killed his brothers, sent Dara's head to their father, and finally imprisoned Shah Jahan. Thus, the prince became Emperor Amalgir, conqueror of the world. Zebenusa was 20 when her father claimed the throne. She moved into the palace, continued her studies, and roamed incognito in Delhi markets with her sister Zinat. They painted and drew and gossiped in the women's quarters. What Zebenusa loved to do most was dance. It began with a grasp of her sister's hand, and together they would spin faster and faster as the space around them blurred with speed. Her sister would finally beg to stop, and so reluctantly, Zeb would slow down, holding tightly onto Zinat's hand, because if she let go, her sister would fall. She was older than Zinat and strong on her feet. When Zinat no longer wanted to spin with her because she would get tired and Zeb would always win, because it was after all a game, a competition to see who would last the longest, Zebenusa would spin on her own. She imagined this was how the Sufis did it, whirling with their feet while keeping their hearts centered on the holy, the sacred. One hand on her body, one hand raised to the sky, her hair streaming, her skirt swirling, lost in the ecstasy, yet aware too that she looked beautiful, that she was better somehow, chosen perhaps. And that was when she would always lose focus and have to stop breathing hard. She was not transcendent, she thought, but a girl. And because of that, she could not obtain the height of spiritualism that the men did. That's what everybody said. Her body was not equipped. That's why she had to remain in the Zenana and not at court with her father and his ministers. That was why the Zenana became a mirror world with its own gardens and markets, with its own food service and plumbing to house all the women of the palace. She longed to write a treatise on the Book of Books, but her father forbade it. So she continued to turn to verse, but she was stopped short in life, just as she was stretching to fit towards what she knew she was capable of. At 40, Zebenusa was certain of what her life held for her. She was the eldest child of the emperor of a country second only to Persia, a country her grandfather 5 times great had conquered and all her grandfathers since had kept. Not one expanded it in size as much as her father. No one had integrated the government with as many Hindus as he, yet there was more tolerance in her great-great-great-grandfather Akbar's time. Next to her uncle Dara, whom she loved for he had encouraged her to read, she loved her ancestor Akbar. Emperor Akbar was illiterate, but he had filled his court with foreigners, with dancers and music and fine food and talk. He got rid of the tax on non-Muslims and tried to find unity within many religions. His libraries were the ones she emulated in her own. Works copied from the Hindu, the Christian, translated into Persian, painted by the greatest miniature painters to be found. Many stories surrounded Zebenusa. She could match couplet to couplet by the court poets to compose poems on the spot in fierce competition. She was a champion chowpar player. She rejected suitors whimsically because it was rumored of a misplaced word, a slight of etiquette. It pleased the court to create a fantasy of a haughty princess, virginal and remote. That she fell in love with her father's sworn enemy, sent him a box full of roses from the royal garden, helped him escape from capture might be a story, but certainly many vied for her hand. Her father had promised his dying wife to give their daughters husbands, but the idea of a son-in-law possibly plotting to steal his throne made him renege. He killed the man she was engaged to, the son of her beloved uncle, Dara, simply because he was Dara's son. Yet Zebenusa had a fire within her that was particular, could not be extinguished until the tragedy that befell her. She became an expert dodger, invisible when she wanted to be. The library became her refuge, books her guide to a world she could imagine but not taste. She began to devour books, requesting copies to be made of foreign texts. She employed calligraphers and painters to illustrate poetry from the ancients on paper burnished, at least 20 years old. She created reading nooks in her gardens, which she filled with scented flowers and ponds. Even her clothing had a stamp of her creativity. Her shoes were richly embroidered with tiny sparkling beads. The soles of her shoes were red. Once her father complained she looked indecent wearing too little clothing, but she replied she had 27 layers of the finest muslin that could pass through a ring on her pinky. 27, asked Zenit? 27, and each more transparent than the last. Anyway, that's some of the work from the new thing. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful, Indira. Thank you. Thanks for giving this sample, and it's just so beautiful and imaginative, and we really, really look forward to its birth for us all to read the entire. So with that, I will switch gears and we'll hear a little bit from our next guest, Murzban Shroff. And as I mentioned, we'll come back together for conversation and further discussion. But I'm delighted to welcome Murzban to our Canio Zoom event. We first met when his book, Breathless in Bombay, was published sometime back. I've forgotten now exactly. And we're also delighted to have this current collection of short stories, Third Eye Rising, available currently. So a little bit about Murzban. He is a Mumbai-based writer, and thank you for joining us at maybe a not so convenient time for you, but we welcome you. Murzban Shroff's fiction has appeared in over 65 literary journals in the US and UK. I think that must be some kind of Guinness Book of World Records, but you'll have to tell us. An amazing accomplishment. Murzban is recipient of the John Gilgan Fiction Award and has garnered 6 Pushcart Prize nominations. His short story collection, Breathless in Bombay, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in the Best Debut category from Europe and South Asia, and rated by The Guardian as among the 10 best Mumbai books. His novel, Waiting for Jonathan Koshy, was a finalist for the Horatio Nelson Fiction Prize. His third book, Fast Track Fiction, serves up a varied collection of literary nuggets for the digital reader. Third Eye Rising was born out of Shroff's travels to the villages of India. So we look forward to hearing from you, Murzban, and thank you so much for joining us. Please welcome Murzban Shroff.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Catherine. It's only thanks to the generosity of people like you that we can be sitting in India and working on US time and hope to get our works published in the US and get the work a platform. Indira, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure hearing you. And, one of your phrases, so I had this talk ready actually, okay? I said, I'm gonna follow this kind of a format and, it's kind of a pretty characteristic format, get into the background of the book. But there was one sentence of yours, Indira, which resonated so deeply with me in your second reading, where you said equality was not a possibility. And I kind of realized how the literary faith conspires to get like-minded people together, because equality is not a possibility is what my entire collection, Third Eye Rising, is based on. So Third Eye Rising, I call it my India collection. And it's not the India of malls and multiplexes. It's not the India of smartphones and four-wheel drives. It's an India which is invisible to most people. It was invisible to me for a long time, for I would say 35, 36 years of my life. It's an India unseen. It's an India dealing with caste, with dowry, with female exploitation, with child apathy, with poverty, intense poverty, different kinds of poverty, different faces of poverty, and with migrant identities. And how did I come to discover this India? Well, what it took for me to discover this was at some point, I had to step out of my comfort zone, which was I had to stop being an urban-centric person. And I had to go to the villages, spend time with tribals, and understand what were the issues that assailed them. So in trying to work in the short story format, what I did was I defined myself as a character-based, issue-based writer. So while Breathless in Bombay, my first book, had issues like civic apathy, corruption in the public sector, usurpation of green zones, very city-centric issues. My India collection has issues like child apathy, female exploitation. With that, I'm going to give you a sample of my title story, Third Eye Rising. Now, in this story, you have this, I would virtually say she's a child bride because she's all of 18, she's very innocent, and she's married into this family of these really machismo, rough-talking carpenters, and she has to go and visit her parents. And when she returns from her parental home, her in-laws are very disappointed that she hasn't got back enough gifts for them. It's some kind of a disguised dowry. So what they do is they cook up a story that she's overstayed out there, so she's had an affair with someone out there because she happened to speak about a tutor who had come to the village, and she was excited about it. So they accuse her of having an extramarital affair, and they said, okay, if you have to prove your purity, if you have to prove your fidelity, you need to go through this horrible baptism by fire kind of a test. And this is something which actually happened. I read a small little snippet in the newspaper. And from that, I started kind of thinking about this girl's faith and what she must have gone through, that a village woman was actually subjected to this. So I'm going to read out a small section. When Minolini completed the trial, her Agni Pariksha, the crowd rose to his feet. At first, no one spoke. Then there was a murmur of disbelief. People wondered how this were possible, and in their hearts they felt glad, like they had fought some terrible battle themselves and won. Gajanan Bijli leaned sideways and hugged his son. The mothers and sisters bent and prayed. Wearing a broad smile, Gajanan Bijli trumpeted Satinder around the quadrangle. Sab Baba log ki jaan hai. He is the pet of all the Babas. Only the Baba's blessings have saved him. Satinder smiled weakly and shot Minolini a glance. She stood shivering on one side, holding the vessel. Sweat ran down her forehead and cheeks. Her mouth was open, her lips quivered. 3 elderly women came and led Minolini away. One of them relieved her of the vessel. They shrank when they saw her burns, and under their breaths they cursed the Bijlis. That Gajanan, what a brute! That Rukmini, what a demon! As for those daughters, the very faces of evil they were. Satinder Bijli did not see Minolini for the rest of the evening. He was expected to mix with the guest. He was expected to play the proud husband and the dutiful host. There was music and dancing and snacks with cold drinks and ice cream. A flautist blew at his flute. The sound tore through Satinder's heart. His mind kept returning to his wife. He felt an emotion he had never felt before, a warm glow of admiration, of respect. He also felt the heat of shame. And under this burden, he brooded and entered a private hell. What right had his father to laugh so heartily, he thought? What right did the mother and sisters have to feel so proud? They were the ones who had accused Minolini. They were the ones guilty. But did their faces reflect that? No. Did anyone bring that up? No. Did anyone rush to Minolini, hold her, comfort her, apologize for misjudging her? No, no, no. Look at the purity of our blood, his mother was saying now. If only some rich boys would realize that. And his sisters would look away demurely, shyly. Oh, how this made Satinder's blood boil. Later, when he crawled into bed beside Minolini, he made no effort to comfort her. How could he? What could he say? What hope could he give that things would improve? He turned his back to her while she trembled with fever and pain. She had covered herself with a blanket, and her eyes, gray dots in the dark, were fixed to the ceiling. She stayed that way for a long time, he longer. Next morning, he was up before the rest. He slipped out to the bazaar where he bought a big bunch of neem leaves. He had heard about the benefits of neem, heard that it could heal. By the time he returned, Minolini was up and busy in the kitchen. A vessel boiled, and from it came the aroma of fresh tea. Satinder stood at the door, watching her struggle, trying to lift the vessel from the stove. She had wrapped a cloth around her wrist and was trying to lift the vessel with the back of her hands. The vessel tilted dangerously. The tea threatened to spill over. In 2 quick strides, he was beside her. Gently, he admonished her. What is the need? Am I not here for you? He took the vessel and looked into her eyes. They appeared frightened and remote. Holding her by the shoulders, he drew her against his chest. God, how he would miss the touch of her small, light fingers. Now they were bruised, damaged stumps, suspended in midair. Once again, Satinder felt anger. A flame of hatred leapt within him. His wife was his and his alone. How dare they decide about her? How dare they doubt her? How dare they force her into public exhibition and torture? For the first time in his life, Satinder felt stronger than his father, stronger than his mother, stronger than the garrulous unity of his sisters. He muffled a sob, and against the small reclining head of Minolini, he went crazy. He kissed it frantically, as though to rid himself of the guilt, as though to make his love abundantly clear. He wanted her to know he wasn't a part of it. He wasn't the judge, nor the prosecutor. He always knew how true she was. So I think this was a story born of my time spent in the villages, speaking to village women. And in 2001 2003 was when I first made a visit to the village to study the issue of displacement. And there I found that a lot of tribals were forcibly being evicted from their homes. And there was certain atrocities which were horrifying. I mean, the women were taken away by the police, they were shaved, they were tonsured, all sorts of things were done to them. And when I asked the men folk, I said, so what do you guys feel? I mean, when you see a woman being taken away, and they said, Saab, what can we do? Because if we react, we know we'll we'll be taken away and they'll never see us again, you know. And then later on, many years later, I also traveled to the villages of Bihar. Bihar and UP are fundamentally known as the Badlands of India. So I went to Bihar to study the condition of schools and to study the condition of the girl child. And I found that in a lot of schools, a majority of the girls were married off by the age of 12. And they were going through certain atrocities in their marital homes, so much so that when we would kind of probe them, they would just start sobbing and they were unable to even tell their stories. So I think this kind of sparked something in me, you know, and said that, you know, one does need to give these people a voice. One does need to talk about what is really going on in the villages. And I also like this whole thing about through Satinder, who's in the title story, who's fundamentally a weak-willed husband because he allows his wife to go through this persecution. But somehow when he sees the damage that it's inflicted, there is a transference of power. And he feels a certain love for Minorini, which enables him to take up for her. So I think this was my own fervent wish that, you know, a woman would get the kind of support, they would get the kind of understanding. So one of the things I discovered that in rural India, 44.5% girls are married off before the legal age. And most of them are between the ages of 12 and 15, you know. So I think Third Eye Rising is one of the stories which was born out of there. There's another story called A Rather Strange Marriage, which is where again a young girl child is exploited. She's thrust into a marriage, which is very exploitative. And the entire village takes up for her, you know, the entire woman in the village. So that's again a kind of a inherent feverish longing for a kind of revolution that one wishes would happen, you know, which empowers the Indian woman. Because ironically, Lord Shiva, who you see here, and who's like considered the Lord of the Arts, he had this iconic relationship with the goddess Parvati. And it's a very sweet love story. So in the title story, in fact, I show how Indian women draw a lot of strength from these myths, you know, and it's kind of ironical that we are in a country where the goddess is held as sacrosanct, is held as supreme, but we don't tend to respect and empower our women to that extent. Okay, now with this, I'm going to now move on to another story, and this is called Bhikhu Badshah's Poison. So one of the things I did when I was in Bihar, as I mentioned, was I visited schools, and I was appalled to see some of the conditions in the schools. So there were schools where which had no drinking water, no doors, no fans, no windows. There was no transportation to bring the children from remote villages. The children had to get there on their own, which exposed them to the risk of getting raped, you know. And there were also no separate toilets for girls, which again put the girl child at a big risk. So, so having been to Bihar and seeing the condition of schools there, public schools, government schools, I started visiting tribal schools in various districts of in various other states. And finally, I came down to kind of researching public schools in Mumbai. And again, what I found was very disappointing because like one of the schools in an eastern suburb of Mumbai, I found was built on top of a public urinal. So children would actually be passing, they would be passing men who would be crouched over the urinal. Another school had construction work going on while school was in progress. So while the classrooms are being repaired, kids were actually forced into narrow little corridors without air, without ventilation, without light. And there was just a little patch of black which was painted on the corridor walls, and that became the blackboard, you know. So I also found teachers were absent. There were principals were absent. Teachers were peeling vegetables in class. The teachers would send students out on errands. You know, they would be asked to go and get vegetables for them to take back home with them, or to repair their footwear, or even to wash their lunch boxes. So when I saw this, I kind of was trying to figure out that what if a migrant worker comes from, say, a place like Bihar, and he comes with the intention, he's a low caste migrant, and he wants to shed his caste, he wants to get away from his caste. So he comes to Mumbai, and here is a chance for him to don a completely new identity. You know, he can wear a completely new identity with hard work and with a little bit of ingenuity. He can raise himself out of his situation. But then what happens when he goes back to his village? Does caste catch up with him? So the hyphenated identities of migrants is another aspect which fascinated me. And out of that was born the story called Bhikhu Badshah's Poison. And here, interestingly, I've used a technique in my objectives to make the short story a meaningful form of literature. I've used a format where I use fiction and I use fact. So I used non-fiction to intersperse and show how that impacts the lives of migrants. So, Bhikhu Badshah's poison. In the month of June 2013, a peon in my office, Bhikhu Badshah, approached me for a loan of 10,000 rupees, saying he would return it from his next few months' salaries. I asked him why he needed the money, to which he said, "What to tell you, sir, how to hide it from you? I am ashamed to say, but the truth is I have to hire a wife, a professional wife." I knew Bhikhu Badshah was married, so I looked at him with suspicion. But solemnly, he continued, "You see, sir, my son has been called to the school for admission. It is a private school, a very good school, not like the municipal schools in Mumbai where the teachers don't come and the children fall sick from eating the midday meal. No, sir, here they teach well and they get good results. And my boy has been very lucky to have been called for an interview. But the school management wants to meet his parents and they want to make sure that both parents are educated. Now you know, sir, that my wife is illiterate. She can barely read or write. Can't even sign her name in English. So I have to hire someone to pose as my wife. And there is this woman who does this on a regular basis. She's a very good actress, has done 1 or 2 TV serials, but she is expensive and charges heavily. That too all in advance, which is okay, sir, because she guarantees results. Morally speaking, I was bound to advise Bhikhu against the consequences of impersonation. But seeing his face, I realized how important this might be for him, the fact that his son gets a good education and rises above his origins. Besides, Bhikhu was a good worker, efficient and reliable. So I consented to the loan, pausing only to ask him how his wife felt about the charade. Was she upset, insecure, hurt, peeved? I asked. "Oh no, sir. She was the one who suggested it," she said. "She said we mustn't take chances with our boy's future. We must do all we can to help him. After all, we don't want him to be like us, struggling to make ends meet." His voice rose. "And this is not the only khacha we have, sir. There's another big expense, 20,000 rupees for the admission, for which I have borrowed from my colleagues. It'll take me 2 years to pay back this amount, maybe longer, but I don't mind. At least my son won't have to face what I have." Being short on time and busy, I did not ask him what he had faced. All I said was, "Don't worry about paying me back, Bhikhu Badshah. You just concentrate on getting your son the admission. The office will bear the expense, but don't whisper a word of this to the other peons. We don't want them asking for loans and advances. That will set a bad precedent." He stood over my desk, fingers entwined, mumbling his thanks, till I waved him off, saying the amount was a reward for his good work, and that if he really wanted to repay me, he should continue working the way he did. I'm now going to jump to the nonfiction part of it. On 16 July 2013, 23 children of the Gandaman Primary School in Saran district of Bihar were poisoned by a midday meal and died. Forensic science laboratories confirmed the presence of monoprotophos, a phosphorus-based pesticide that was lethal for birds, animals, and humans. The pesticide was found in the oil and in the mix of rice and soybean curry, in a quantity that was 5 times in excess of the amount used normally in pest control. An investigation revealed that the oil was stored at the house of the school principal and that it had been brought from there. Within 5 minutes of eating, the children began to vomit uncontrollably and doubled up with pain. Foaming at the mouth, they had to be rushed to the nearest government hospital on motorcycles. There was no ambulance and no doctors, and 16 of the children had died in their parents' arms. The newspapers in Bombay tracked this news for 3 days, after which nothing. During this time, I thought of Bhikhu Badshah, on leave on his annual vacation, to his village in Bihar. No wonder he did not want to place his son in a government school, I thought with a shudder. Back to fiction. The motorcycle man felt the child's breath on his back, then a hiccup like a lurching, and something lurched in his heart too. Was it that he was riding too fast? Was it that his hands were sweaty, his grip unsteady? Or was it that the burden of caste had caught up with him again? Today, no one remembered the caste he came from, the lowest of the low, the carrier of the dead. sought in all matters of the dead, the cleaning of bodies and their disposal, the cleaning of the cremation grounds, the stench that was impossible to shake off. The smell remained in your hair and in your nostrils. It remained in your head while you were awake and when you slept. And he himself had fled to the city only to shed all that, to forget where he came from. Wasn't the motorcycle evidence of that? That and the way he rode it, proud and upright, making it a point to wave to people, those he knew and those he didn't. But being there in the city, no one would notice him. No one would stop and look at him questioningly. No one would remember how he had started and how hard he had worked to raise himself out of his origins. The city was too busy to care about caste, birth, and the burden of karma. As long as you could survive, as long as you could meet your cost of living, you were fine. That was the unspoken law of the city. But here in the village, he was somebody, Bhikkhu Badsha, the man who had made it in the city, the man who had made his family proud. When he stepped off the train coming home, he had worn a suit and dark glasses. He had carried gifts in his hand and unloaded so many bags, like a man who had attached wealth to his name. He had his own shanty in Mumbai, for which he was paying 4,000 rupees a month. And now he was planning to send his boy to a private school. How many men from his village did that? How many, huh? And apart from all that, he owned a motorcycle, which he kept parked in a cowshed. And on this, he gave the village children a ride whenever he came home. On one such ride, he had been flagged down. Oh, stop, brother, stop. Stop and help, please. Our children are dying. They have been poisoned by those whom we trusted, the school where they studied. Stop, brother. Thank God for your kindness. Can you take this child, please, to the government hospital? My nephew will accompany you and he will explain to you, the doctors, how this happened, this terrible tragedy. Please, brother, don't ask for explanations now. There is no time to lose, no time at all. Kunta Devi's son has rolled up his eyes, and Uma Devi too is giving up hope for her daughter. Why, thank you, son, thank you. There, slowly. You see, Arvind will hold her from the back, and between him and you, she will be fine. But you will drive carefully, won't you? She's in so much pain, and look how her eyes roll, as they though see Yamaraj. And now Bhikkhu Badsha wondered whether the body slumped against his back was that of a girl who had once run through the fields, chasing birds and butterflies, a girl who would help her mother make chapatis, her sister draw rangoli patterns at their doorstep, who would feed cows and goats and whisper to them her sweet little secrets, who would have endless questions for her grandmother and be fearful of her father, of his long dark silences. He wondered whether the soft little head bobbing against his back had any life in it, and whether the increasing dampness on his shirt was that of saliva or of blood or of poison. And he opened throttle and tore into the wind, as though escaping the shadow of death, the thought of being taken for a carrier of doom once again. So this is Bhikkhu Badsha. He runs away from the city. I mean, he runs away from the village, goes to the city, makes his little nest out there. But when he comes back to the village, his caste catches up with him, you know. And I use this whole thing about a midday meal, you know, and this BR food poisoning tragedy. So this was in 16 July 2013. I was there when this food poisoning tragedy had happened. I could not visit the school. It was in a different part of Bihar, but 23 children were poisoned. And we didn't hear anything. After a couple of months, we heard nothing about why it happened, how it happened. Was there some political agenda, you know, to embarrass the government? And so this is a story I built around Bhikkhu Badsha, a migrant identity, basically. Mm. And Marianne, Catherine, how are we doing for time?
Thank you. Yeah, Murzban, just perfect, just perfect.
So great. Shall we take some questions now?
Yes, I think I wish we had a whole nother hour. I'm so gripped and moved by both the readings, and I do remember reading about this true incident of the school poisonings, you know, here in our New York papers. It was just unbearable. Both of you are writing with such passion and sensitivity. I just want to pick up on a statement that you made, Murzban, which I think may apply for both of you, Indira, as well. You said you became very interested in giving voice to the voiceless as you were exploring, you know, the situations in the rural parts of India. And, you know, that's a delicate situation. I feel you're bringing, you know, tremendous passion and sensitivity. And for you, Indira, writing about a historical figure who's obviously in the past, I wondered if you might each speak a little bit about how you approach this notion of giving voice, you know, to others. And also tied in with that, in the background, I have to confess ignorance of the book market in India, but I am wondering if your works have been translated, and I know there are many different languages. But first, just on the topic of giving voice to the voiceless, how do you each approach that?
Indira?
Ladies first, we're being polite.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that I'm, you know, the idea of, you know, do you have the authority to speak for someone who might be quite different? In this case, for me, my main character is a Muslim woman who's a, you know, a Mughal princess. And I was born, raised as a Hindu woman. And it's kind of astonishing to think, okay, I'm going to give voice to this woman. There's also another woman in the story who is a little bit more contemporary, and that's Gauri Lakesh, who was assassinated. She was a Bangalore journalist who was kind of ruthlessly assassinated at her doorstep, I think in 2017, I think. Whose story I heard just about in this time, I heard of Zebanusa. And so it seemed to me that women who are, you know, sharing their political views, which might be different than the majority rule, have always been in danger, and nothing has changed in that. So I think these, and the fact that Zebanusa's story has been erased even from historical documents of her, you know, about her father, is astonishing to me as well. My work, I'm lucky. Well, you know, India has such a vast book market. I think my early books were pirated and just sort of published, you know, in newspapers. And then the last book was actually published from a house in India. Yes, it was. So, yeah, and of course, so many languages. Actually, it's not been translated. It's only been published in English.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, interesting.
So just to lend a little amusing touch to this whole discussion, you know, Indira, you just spoke about your book being pirated. So I want to share a little anecdote here. So, you know, Catherine, Marianne, my first book, Breathless in Bombay, got me into a lot of trouble with the right wing. And I went through intense persecution in the courts of Mumbai and South India. That was a saga by itself. We won't get into it now. But on the last day when my judgment was going to be delivered, and I happened to step out of the courtroom for lunch, suddenly this young urchin jumps in front of me and says, sir, you must buy this book and all that. And he brings out a pirated version of Breathless in Bombay. And I said, okay, but can you give me a reason why I should buy this book? He said, sir, big problem book. It's creating a lot of problem. I said, I see, for who? He said, problem books, sir, don't ask, you know. So I said, no, this has to be, there's some kind of serendipity, some kind of metaphysical conspiracy happening here, you know. But anyway, that was just a little aside. So for me, giving voice to the voiceless was, I think, quite by accident and partly by design. You know, initially when I started, so my journey has been very transformative. My journey as a writer has been very transformative. I think that's why I think it kind of, I mean, I transformed myself and therefore I could transform the writing. But how it happened was that when I initially started writing short stories, and I deliberately chose the short story form because I could address so many more issues, I used to write plot-based stories, you know, and then I realized that something wasn't quite working in the sense that, you know, I realized that I really did not know how my fellow Indians thought. Therefore, I felt, let me start going to the villages. Now, why I also started going to the villages is interesting, because one is I realized that there was too much writing and there was too little literature happening. So I needed to give my readers a very strong reason if I had to put out a book. Second thing, I read a very interesting nugget about how Steinbeck, who I assume is favorite with all of us, how Steinbeck came to write The Grapes of Wrath. So apparently he had written, at one point, he had written a satirical version of The Grapes of Wrath. But then when he started actually writing pieces on the labor camps, he realized how misguided he was. And he went and destroyed 3 years of work, and he rewrote the book that finally brought him home to his territory, which was the working class of America. So I was so inspired by that, and that's how I started going to the villages. Now, when I went to the villages and I saw this whole displacement issue and villagers being evicted, so I asked them, I said, why do you think this is happening to you all? Why this kind of exploitation? Why are you all being thrown off your lands? And they had no cognizance, no awareness of the conspiracy of a dam being built. They had no awareness of that it was for a power project, it was for a dam. They said that, but this has been historically happening to us. It's part of our ethos, So this has been happening to us. They were so accepting of all this, So then I started getting interested in this whole phenomena of poverty and its implications. And I realized that in India, there are so many different kinds of poverty, unlike other countries where you just have a kind of hard-boiled, gritty kind of poverty. Here we have caste-based poverty. We have environment-based poverty, or what I call geographic poverty. We have health-based poverty. We have literacy-based poverty. We have disaster-based poverty. And we have something called man-made poverty, which is where man forces man out of his own territory. And therefore, farmers are perfectly prosperous. They are happy in the villages. They get everything from nature. And yet they're being shafted out of their environment. So then they come to the cities and they form slums. And how do we expect them to feel any onus for a city that they've been forced into? So you see, once I went out in search of a story, I came back with a new sensibility. And the minute I stood transformed, I think I could make a difference to the transformation. And slowly I started putting my work out with various journals, and I started getting acceptance. And I think one of the things which happened was that despite there being such a strong cultural divide between American society and India, I think a lot of my editors sense the authenticity in the work, and they sense the purpose behind the work, And that's how I managed to sort of notch up all these publication credits. And then, of course, it's continued. I consider myself an issue-based writer, so anything which fires my imagination, I chase it up, get to the bottom of it. I collect more information than I need, and then I write.
That makes sense.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting from both of you. And of course, Steinbeck is certainly dear to us here in Sag Harbor. A quick plug to mention that we're working very diligently to hope to preserve his home here in Sag Harbor. There's more about that on our website. But thank you both for your answers on that one. We did also mention our interest in you speaking a little bit about your influences. I know we're just about coming to the end of our time. And I also want to give a chance, if there's someone in our audience who has a question, you might quickly raise your hand or jot it into the chat. Of course, if someone is pressed for time, we thank you for joining us. But while folks may be formulating a question, would either of you like to speak a moment or two about your chief, writer mentors or writer influences? I know, Murzban, your work has been compared to Chekhov. Indira, I happen to know you love Virginia Woolf, but we don't need to leave it there. If either of you would like to, just briefly mention your writer heroes, mentors, or guiding lights.
Listening to you, Murzban, talking about the importance of the short story, I was also reminded of, I grew up with, my mom was a great fan of Kalki, and there's a whole history of short story in India, Narayan, of course. Let's see. So I was wondering, did Indian writers influence you? I'll ask you.
Ironically, my biggest influences have been the Russians, of course. Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Isaac Babel. You know, Babel was killed for his short stories, right?
Yeah.
So, in fact, when Stalin's secret police pulled him out, his only regret was they did not let me complete my stories. You know, so so the Russians. Then among the French writers, there's I love Anais Nin and Camus, of course. And then actually my roots are very much in American literature. So for me, my heroes are, and you know, I'm like self-taught virtually. So what happened is when I jumped off the corporate bandwagon and decided to become a writer, you know, I just spent a lot of time with my icons. So there was Steinbeck, there was James Baldwin, F. Scott Fitzgerald, whom I absolutely adore, and yeah, Henry Miller. You know, these were some of my greatest, and Bellow, Philip Roth, John Updike, also some of the contemporary writers, great American writers like J. Robert Lennon. Another writer whom I absolutely dote on is Ben Fountain. I've read all his works, you know. So I have my roots very strongly in American literature. I think the US is really breaking new ground in literature.
Thank you. Thank you.
Writers
in that context, Indira, I would like to share a small observation, you know. So I have, of course, read a lot of Indian writers and, you know, I mean, Venkat Mistry, Jhumpa, you know, and I find something very, very sentient about your work, you know. So I remember in one of the reviews of your book, I think it was the Kirkus review, and the book they reviewed was The Inheritance, where they say that something to the effect of her ingenious charm as a social and spiritual observer bejewels this book, you know. So I think so that is the interesting part about Indian writing. So, you know, if you can use it to make social commentary at the same time, have this undercurrent of spirituality which is running through, you know. Because writing, as we know, is a spiritual pursuit eventually, right? You know, it takes us into spaces we don't know we are going to venture into. So I found something very sentient about your work in that sense, you know.
It's interesting. It's because a lot of, you know, I grew up also, you know, when you're an immigrant, because I was an immigrant in America, I grew up with a lot of mythology, a lot of stories from Ramayana and Mahabharata. Actually, we weren't even allowed to keep Mahabharata in the house, right? Because it's supposed to bring, if you kept a book of war, it meant that your family will fight. I think that was
That's right.
Belief.
Yes,
it was crazy. Interesting ideas. But no, the spectacle of religion is also so fascinating. I mean, the notion of you know, the kind of rituals you perform in order to bring about good crops or, you know, good fortune. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, but thank you for the observation.
Yeah. But you know,
people that I too like the Russians, and I too like Isaac Babel. I think when I read him, my eyes were just opened in a way, because he could write about childhood with such, you know, intensity. You know, there was like such a so much noise around him, and yet he could like also like cut through that and reveal something that was like an insight that was so astonishing.
Right. It reminds me of what Cheever, you know, Babel's writing reminds me of something that John Cheever has said, you know, about writing, that if you cannot write a story to match the intensity of a mass protest on the streets, you know, don't write it. You might as well not write it, you know. So Cheever is another writer who I'm very fond of, you know. So
thank you for that, both of you. I'm very much appreciative of your bringing in the aspect of spirituality. I wish, again, we had another half hour or hour to delve into that, and I have an idea perhaps to invite you back for a panel that focuses, you know, particularly on that aspect as writers and as creative people. I'm just, you know, coming back around to see if any of our audience members have questions. And if not, in the interest of time, I just want to point out some folks did have to leave early, but offered their thanks and well wishes, which you can see in the chat. Last call for questions. Catherine.
Thank you. Not really a question as much as a comment. First of all, thank you both. I really enjoyed listening to the different voices and the different works that you read from and the discussion. And it kind of brings to mind something that I've been thinking about lately, which is the importance of art to be able to tackle difficult issues in a way that allows people in a way that fosters either dialogue or greater understanding. And so both of you have indicated that in your comments, and I think writers have that ability, as other artists do as well, to try to, open up the world and bring people a little bit closer from the divide that has been so evident over the last several years and seems to be continuing. So anyway, just wanted to thank you both for that. And we look forward, of course, to both books being published here in the US. Indira, your new book, can hardly wait for that. Murzban for yours is coming out in 2022 here in the US. So I did drop in the chat earlier how you can actually own books by both of these writers via either bookshop.org, which is a fantastic online offering that supports small independent bookstores like Canio's, or just call us or stop by to get them. But thank you both.
Thank you very much, Mary and Catherine. Indira.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you to my readers.
Great to see you all. We so appreciate it. Thanks to our audience and our special guests, Indira Ganesan, Murzban Shroff. Peace, good works, creativity to come. Let us all meet again very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.